one of our Friday, now regular Friday discussions of essays and speeches by Dr. Leonard Peikoff, the world's greatest living authority on the philosophy of objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand. And now as a regular feature, I hope you are used to him now, Ed Slantiev will be my interlocutor on this. Just to set the context, the speech today that we will be discussing was one he delivered back in 1983. For the first time, Philosophy and Psychology in History. It was reprinted in the Objectivist Forum shortly after that. So, as a way of context building here, what we're talking about is the causes of human history. What's behind it? Objectivism's basic theory is that philosophy is the principle, the fundamental cause of human history. We have a philosophy-centric idea of what is really behind human history. And there have been any number of other theories, great men theories, economic theories like Marx's, many theories of what moves history. And the one that Dr. Peikoff focuses on here in this particular context is the role of psychology, which he regards as actually the most plausible alternate fundamental explanation for human history. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ed.
Yeah, thank you very much, James, and pleasure to be here again. Will you start us off with breaking down what is the role of history in philosophy? How is it used? And what can be learned from that relationship?
Well, the reciprocal relationship between philosophy and history is very similar to the reciprocal relationship that philosophy has with every other science, with every other field of study. Philosophy is the broadest of abstractions, and so in effect it must cover everything. It must cover everything. It's relevant to everything in that it defines and sets what we regard as knowledge, what qualifies as knowledge, and sets the agenda for all of our basic values and ethics. As such, it is inescapable in every other field. To do history, one has to, in effect, have an approach, a methodological approach to history for it to work. So history depends upon our understanding of history, our study of history depends upon philosophy. In terms of history's impact on philosophy, it is a particular one. It is the data of human events insofar as we know it through the course of history. And that forms a factual basis from which philosophy generates ideas. But this is true of every other field. Philosophy must account for, on one hand, every aspect of human existence, including the facts of history. And on the other hand, philosophy sets the agenda for every other field of study. But history plays an important role because it provides a factual and inductive basis for understanding humanity, how humans have lived, what their societies have been like, across the board, whether it's science, religion, culture, politics, you name it. That is a database from which philosophy can inductively arrive at principles, but it is the principles of philosophy which then in turn will shape the way we understand history.
Okay, so the main case that Peikoff builds here is that the cause and effect relationship between history and psychology is such that in fact, pardon me, between psychology and philosophy is such that one causes the other. So this presupposes the knowledge of cause and effect, or in fact a law of causality, which is a law of identity as applied to action. Right, so could you give us an overview of law of causality and how it is important in this context?
In this context, it's relatively complex. At any level, we can see that actions in the physical world, all actions, are in effect caused by the nature of the entity which is acting. I release a hammer, it will fall to the ground. I release a helium balloon, it will rise. And I come to realize that the nature of the thing which is acting will determine how it will act and interact with everything else. Give an example. Scientists early on discovered that there were 5 stars in the observable stars in the night sky that didn't move in regular pattern like the rest of the stars that just moved across in an even plane across the night sky. So what are these 5 wanderers that have their own path, these weird stars that are making their own path? Well, it had to be discovered that the Earth was going around the sun, and that just like the Earth was going around the sun, these other planets are, and that their orbits around the sun, like ours, explains why these 5 stars are different, say, in the visible night sky, are different than the rest of the stars that one can visibly see. And there's a simple example from physical causation. And of course, you get further, as knowledge develops, we understand it more. Kepler comes to understand the patterns of planetary motion, and then when Newton comes along, he finds the underlying cause for that, gravity. By understanding the principles of gravity, he can then explain why the planets move around as they do. Humans are not planets, obviously. They are a very complex thing, and indeed a more complex form of causation is necessary to explain their behavior. On an individual level, it's easy to see that people think and choose, for example, and have the capacity of volition. So I would say there are 2 premises here that we're sort of assuming. And if you don't have these objectivist ideas understood, this discussion will make very little sense to you. One is the nature of causality. The other is human psychology. What are the causes of human psychology? And that has only been a relatively recent discovery, that human emotions, major aspects of human personality, are caused and shaped by our thinking, by our values, by the evaluative thought that goes on in our head. We reach certain conclusions, evaluative conclusions, and that is what forms and shapes our emotions. So, cause when it comes to human psychology is absolutely instrumental when we're discussing this. Causes of human changes in human behavior are critical for this. So causation in the human sense is far more complex than it is with other entities. There's just no question about it. With respect to something so complex as human history, you have to start with individuals. What motivates and causes, in effect, human behavior on an individual level. And of course, it is our thinking, it is our beliefs, it is our values, and our emotions. But if our emotions are the result of whether subconsciously, implicitly, and that happens to a large extent, or explicitly, the value judgments that we come to will shape our psychology. So an individual's psychology is shaped by his thinking. If a person thinks a certain way, it will have an effect on how he feels about certain things. Dr. Peikoff has a great example of how emotions are not independent, but are the result of cognition. His classic example, not in this essay, but in other contexts, he'll take the same example, a microscope with a slide, some microbe slide under a microscope, and he'll have different people look at the same microscope. If it is, say, a research scientist, and this proves his theory, he's going to feel elation. Hey, my scientific theory has been proven. Well, let's say it's a medical doctor who knows where the slide came from, and this means that his friend has got a terminal case of cancer. The same perception, the same slide will cause him to feel sadness and grief. Let's take a modern artist. He might see some squirrely blotch of colors and feel inspired to do some great work of art by it. Let's take a Christian from the Middle Ages. Oh, Augustine, science is the lust of the eyes. He would have contempt for it. It's this science business. So even looking into it won't change his attitude. The whole thing is evil, and he has contempt, the emotion of contempt. Or you take a primitive savage, and he looks at it. He's just scared. He just doesn't know what it is. It's this frightening thing that gives him a different kind of vision, and he doesn't know what he's looking at. So depending upon your values, the values you bring to any given perception or experience, that will shape your emotional reaction to it. There are no given um, innate emotions. People think, for example, that survival is somehow, or egoism is somehow innate in people. Well, this is obviously not true. People can act in horrifically self-destructive ways. What can explain the medieval flagellant, literally whipping his back bloody to prove that he's devoted to his religion? What about the medieval saints who would practically starve themselves to death? They take vows of poverty and celibacy. Obviously, it is the philosophical values, the Christian philosophical values, which are turning these kind of self-abusing, self-immolating people into heroes. And so in a medieval context, the values of the time will generate, in effect, the psychology that prizes these self-abnegating monks and nuns as being heroes. In another context, of course, let's go back to ancient Rome. In fact, what's the difference between, say, ancient Rome and when Christians took over? There was this transition period where Christianity was taking over. Neoplatonistic mysticism was taking over. At one time, aristocratic young men would go into the Roman army because the Romans valued military things so much, and they regarded their empire as a sacred thing. They were a very sexually, compared to Christian culture, a sexually liberal culture. Sexually open culture. And by the end of the Roman Empire, women were refusing to have sex with their husbands. And men were, instead of joining the Roman army, they were joining monasteries and taking vows of poverty and peace and pacifism. The idea of Christianity was changing the psychology of the period, was changing the way who people regarded as inspirational heroes, what our values are, and what the psychology was. And that all plays into it. But it was the basic ideas of Christianity and Neoplatonism that changed the culture of the Roman Empire and led to its fall in the Dark Ages.
Right. So that's a very deep explanation about how the law of causality manifests itself in history, and that's very informative. Before I go to my next question, Apollo Zeus sends us a super chat. Thank you very much. And at this point, I have a slight objection regarding the law of causality. Let me play a devil's advocate here. So in Alex Epstein's brilliant book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels,
really good.
he ascribes the effects of economic prosperity to the quantity and magnitude of the amount of fossil fuels that we consume. Now, the first argument that I came up with against this was, well, how does he come to conclude that it's exactly that cause that led to that effect? Why does he not, let's say, why does he discount roles maybe of, let's say, political freedom or some other cause that also had part to play in something like an industrial revolution that has led to economic prosperity? So my question really is, how do we validate certain cause and effect relationships, and how do we with certainty say that this cause leads to that effect? How do we validate cause and effect relationships?
Well, causality as such is an axiom. We grasp that things act according to their natures at a very early stage in development, and it forms the foundation from which we can make every other causal assertion that we make about things and discovery that we make about things. So it is a fundamental axiom that cannot really be questioned. On the other hand, its application in particular areas can be complex, and you've got to understand the context in which you're applying it. And for something as complex as human history, objectivism does not say that philosophy is the only causal factor in human history. Human history has multiple causal factors. What we say is the essential, the fundamental cause, and it depends on what level of abstraction you're looking to. If I can make an economic argument, for example, that price controls will lead to a shortage, that level of causation is the only level of causation I need to get to. I observe a shortage, I observe the price control that came before it. I can work out causally how one led to the other without ever having to go deeper into philosophy. Or perhaps this is a good example. In the 1300s, in the 14th century, Europe faced a devastating plague, the bubonic plague. In the course of that century, particularly in the course of a couple of decades in that century, 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population was wiped out. Are we saying that the bubonic plague did not play a causal role in history? I think it did. The 1200s, the 13th century, the century that came before, was a revolution in Western thought. Thomas Aquinas did his works in this century. Aristotle was flooding in to Christian thought at this time, a whole new perspective on ideas, and that was getting Europe moving towards the Renaissance, moving in a positive direction. Did the bubonic plague slow that down? It sure did. It put the brakes on it and slowed down, in my view, what would have been a faster acceleration towards Renaissance. But it didn't stop the move toward Renaissance. All the bubonic plague could do would condition, how does one react to the bubonic plague? Well, mostly it was a religious mentality. So let's kill the Jews because the Jews must be responsible for the plague. Or let's kill all the cats because the cats must be. Let's ask the church what's going on here. Or you can take a more Aristotelian, natural, causal view of it. So your reaction to the plague will differ based upon your philosophy. And so it was. Some people reacted with what were the dominant ideas of the time, Christianity, most people, but other people did not. Other people took a different angle on it. So the crisis, whatever a physical crisis, say, is, a famine, a plague, doesn't tell you how people are going to react to it. That will be determined based on their beliefs and values, the ideas they actually hold. And so it depends on the level of abstraction that you're asking here about causality. We're talking about the basic course of human history, masses of people, what causes them to basically move in one direction or the other. We're not talking about, for example, the effects of a price control or the effects of an energy shock or even the effects of something like a bubonic plague on how fast the Renaissance comes about. All of those can have independent causal factors, and all of those, in a sense, can be causal factors in human history. What we're saying is that the fundamental cause of human history, when it comes to looking at history from the 10,000 meter elevation, looking at the forest as opposed to the trees, the fundamental causal factor are ideas, and most importantly, the broadest ideas, the ideas that shape how people think and value, that is, philosophical ideas.
Okay, so let me produce the following statement. A dominant philosophy of a given period of time determines how the vast majority of men use their minds. Now, this is a very broad principle, and I say this kind of principle needs to be validated inductively using many pieces of concrete evidence that we can gather over the ages. You have rightly said, and I agree, that history gives us a pool of data that we can claim from and thereby validate our inductive statements. So how would we begin validating the statement? Where would we start from? What pieces of evidence will we start looking at?
Well, one is, what shapes an individual? Let's start at the individual level before we get to the group level. An individual's emotions are shaped by his ideas, by his values, by the evaluations he's come to. Those are the causes, in effect, a fundamental aspect of our psychology, our emotional reactions beyond the physical pleasure and pain. I mean, if you put a pin, as Peikoff says, if you put a pin into a communist or if you put a pin into an objectivist, they'll both go, ouch. We all have the physiology of human beings, and at the physical level, it's pretty straightforward, regular and automatic. But at the emotional level, when it comes to our abstract values, we experience the pleasure and pain mechanism in a different way. We feel anger to injustice, for example. Those kind of emotions, the emotions of the person before the microscope, for example, that I used in the example, those are caused by values. Those are caused by philosophical level ideas. Now, when we're talking about the masses and the dominant ideas of the time, that most people's thinking is shaped by the dominant ideas of the time, all we're saying there is that very few people are creative thinkers at the level of philosophy. We're all too big, and not to say that we're not, there can't be a culture of largely creative thinkers, but even there, most of our, specialists, we're focused on some particular area. You're a research scientist in cancer. I'm an attorney who practices criminal law. And therefore, most of us are dependent upon the ideas and expertise of a special category of specialists, philosophers. And philosophers, since they're the ones who are doing the creative thought at the level of philosophy, are in effect those people from whom we get, the rest of us get our ideas. So at an individual level, we can see that philosophy is what's shaping largely, any individual, you could come up on your own with better philosophical ideas, and therefore change your psychology into a better way, into a better state, or worse state, no question about that. But how will your ideas affect others and actually shape the course of history? So when asking a question of what moves and shapes the directions of history, we have to go beyond any individual, because individuals can have traumas in your childhood's particular, the way your mother treated you, the ideas that you've developed will create a unique psychology in you, but that may not be representative of the dominant psychology of the time. To find the dominant psychology, though, we have to find the dominant ideas, since ideas are what underlies psychology. Now, going back out to the 10,000 meter level, what's the evidence before us? What's the difference between the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the American Revolution of 1776? Both were revolutions. Both had the effect of changing their society. What's the difference? One led to Stalin and one of the most horrific mass murders and totalitarian dictatorships in human history. The other led to the United States, a place where individual freedom started expanding and production took off. What explains the difference? Philosophy. The ideas that were dominant in the 18th century were ideas of reason, individualism, and freedom. The ideas that dominated the turn of the 20th century that led to communism were socialism, communism, that was sweeping across the West and the intellectuals of the West. So ideas are the fundamental difference between two political revolutions, 150 years apart. The difference is ideas. We can multiply the examples over and over and over. What made classical civilization, Greek culture in the ancient world, different? The ideas that it generated. It valued thought. It valued rigorous scientific inquiry. It valued logic. It had a whole positive view about what humanity could be. And those ideas shaped the revolution of Greek thought. And that's why the Greeks had such a distinctive culture. It was the result of dominant ideas. And those dominant ideas did create a dominant psychology. So just as the dominant psychology of the American Revolution was independence. I want to pursue my own happiness. I want a right to be left alone and have my own property. those ideas could take hold in a way and create a psychology that fed into an emotional desire to have this be the kind of revolution we have. Ditto the communists. They had an entirely different psychology that manifests from their ideas. Ditto in the ancient world. A certain psychology about humanity is what's shaping the Greek Revolution. And as I say, as the classical world falls apart, what is it? It's the rise of mysticism and a very negative view of humanity, a very negative view of the capacity of reason and the role of the individual. When that takes hold, then suddenly success in this world, political success or military success, which was so important to the Roman mentality in its height, has now been replaced by an otherworldly focus, giving up wealth, taking vows of poverty and celibacy. Suddenly this world isn't their focus, it's another world that's their philosophical focus, and that's going to shape a psychology.
Okay, so let me just try to reiterate this and try to summarize this in my own words to make sure that I understand this.
Mm-hmm.
So we start with introspective observation of ourselves. We see that our values and our emotions interact in a certain way. Our values are the products of the ideas. The ideas are the products of philosophy. Is that the logical chain so far?
That is the logical chain.
Okay.
It works for an individual, but now what we're at, since we know that about the individual, it must work on a larger scale, but obviously there's going to be variations and outliers and exceptions because not everyone's on the same page psychologically in any given era. There could be in the Enlightenment a mystic. There could be in classical Greece someone who rejects reason. And there certainly were examples of that. But those individuals were irrelevant at the time because they did not reflect the dominant ideas at the time. So the dominant ideas will become the dominant factor when we're looking at large numbers of human beings.
Right, and so then viewing the effects of ideas on an aggregate level of a population is a step forward from this introspective observation. So so to once again reiterate what you have said and to summarize it, on an aggregate level, you have to look at other factors. So you have to look at how the individual agents within a society interact with each other. So you're saying there may be outliers in the picture. So it may not be the environment may not be ripe for a certain kind of ideas. So okay, am I getting?
Yes.
Am I getting the essence of it?
You are getting the essence of it, in effect. There is an outlier factor that always has to be taken into account. What we're talking about here is how can a person's psychology affect the world around him apart from, I mean, we each have our own psychologies, and to some extent, if we're free to, we can create our own environment. We're not talking about individuals here, we are talking about large numbers. And because we're talking about large numbers, we have to be talking about the dominant ideas. If we consider, for example, the other causation theories that are offered, say the Marxist materialist economic perspective on history, it's just simply not sufficiently explanatory. Yes, the Industrial Revolution had all these selfish people pursuing their material prosperity, and they were living in a world of private property, and so they were economically ambitious. And so you've got a lot of economically ambitious people. But how can you explain, for example, the Middle Ages, where people were thinking that poverty was the blessed state, the fortunate state? And boy, I really want to be poor. I really want to flagellate my own back. I really want to be a celibate and renounce this world. See, there's no innate emotion there. And economics is really the result of philosophy. And we can see it on that level too. Or Carlyle's view of great man theory. Well, sure, it's great men in various fields, scientists, politicians, military figures, who are very influential in the course of history. But what makes those guys in that era great men? Could Hitler have been a great man at the time of the American Revolution? No. Could Thomas Jefferson have been a great man in Nazi Germany? No. Could Ayn Rand have even written The Fountainhead in the country where she was born, Russia, when it became a Soviet totalitarian dictatorship? No. Could, for example, a super rational guy in the Middle Ages have changed the whole world? Well, he's got to do it in stages like Aquinas did, and he's got to do it by philosophy. But if he is just an outlier, he's not going to have a significant impact, however rational he is. In fact, he'll be burnt at the stake if he's too rational.
I see. Now, if we flip this relationship around and for the purpose of our conversation, try to analyze it from the negative perspective, why can we not say that a childhood trauma of Hitler or Kant has led to their respective philosophy? Why can we not reverse this particular cause and effect that we have established? Why can we not invert it on its head?
Well, as we were saying, there are individual outliers in any given period of history, people who stand outside of the dominant cultural trends and therefore, to some extent, must stand outside the dominant philosophical ideas of their period. But that makes them, in effect, irrelevant. That makes them footnotes and side issues. There are always power lusters, like Adolf Hitler. And let's go back further. There are always people with childhood traumas. There are always people who, whose parents abuse them. There are always people who grow up in extreme poverty. That isn't enough to explain a psychology, I think. There has to, even on the individual level, be a role that ideas and cognition is playing in turning this traumatized child into a power-lusting Adolf Hitler. But even ignoring all that, assuming you have the psychology of a Hitler, as I say, if you were to put Adolf Hitler at the time of the American Revolution, he would have been regarded as a nut, a criminal. He would have had all kinds of social sanctions placed on him. What are you talking about? People have to sacrifice their happiness for the race, for the nation? That idea would have been treated with hostility at the time of the American Revolution. No, we're all about the pursuit of happiness. We're all about individual rights. Each human has the individual right to pursue their own happiness. They have a natural egoism built into their thinking. And that egoism means that individuals should be left alone to do their own thing. We're not looking for leaders and power lusters. We don't want power lusters. George Washington was the hero of the American Revolution. Why? Because when he was the general who won the battle, he retired. Don't make me king. When the Constitution was written, they said, well, we need you to be our first president. Well, I'll be elected, but I'll quit after 2 terms because I don't want to be a king. So the hero of the period was the result of the dominant ideas of the period. Not only did the period create a George Washington, but it rewarded a George Washington because everyone admired George Washington. And Adolf Hitler, there could have been all kinds of people with the same traumas kind of traumas that Hitler had that would turn them into a, boy, I want to dominate people and control people. But Adolf Hitler is neutralized. The Adolf Hitler psychology is neutralized in the psychology of the Enlightenment. The American Enlightenment doesn't tolerate it. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson, say he had a positive psychology. I'm not going to get into the details of Jefferson's psychology, but let's say he had a healthy attitude that psychologically said, no, I'm secure enough to let people be free, individuals to do their own thing. And let's say he took that psychology, built in the ideas that it was, into Nazi Germany. Hitler was the guy who was going to be we have, as Peikoff pointed out, a population that has been trained into submission. They're looking for leaders. They've been told reason is inefficacious, so they're insecure. They're told the individual is irrelevant, so they need a leader. They're dependents looking for a leader. And of course, the same kind of psychology is more likely to create an Adolf Hitler, but only an Adolf Hitler will be elevated to leadership status by such a culture. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they don't have a chance in Nazi Germany. So while there can be individual variations, a psychology, the toilet training of Adolf Hitler is irrelevant unless his psychology matches the dominant philosophy of his time. So the psychology of Adolf Hitler would be irrelevant in effect in revolutionary America. The psychology of George Washington would be made irrelevant in Nazi Germany. So we don't deny that individuals have unique psychologies distinct to them. What a historical trend is, and what the dominant philosophical ideas create, are the conditions that will either make a Hitler the worshipped leader, the Fuhrer that we all look up to as a mystic leader, or George Washington, the venerated hero of the time. Two totally different men with two totally different psychologies. But those individuals in different cultures would have been utterly inefficacious.
I would even put it in slightly closer proximity to George Washington and say that the mass populace in the United States saw George III and George Washington. They saw the effects of one and the effects of another, and we know by history which choice the people made. So
this is true. There's a feedback effect, and Peikoff talks about the two ways in which philosophy can control history. One, directly, intellectually, what they hear from intellectuals, and that comes down in 100 different forms. The philosopher sets the basic intellectual agenda. He is the one looking at the most abstract issues, the broad issues that affect everybody in methodology and values. But it comes down through scientists. It comes down through whether they exist or not, what people are studying, if they're studying. Art, what kind of art do people value and therefore gets patronized and bought in the period, and people put in their churches or hang on their walls. You can look at it in science, art, politics, but these are all ways in which philosophy is having its effect, the streaming down effect. But there's also a feedback effect. Once philosophical ideas start having a historical effect, it'll start changing the institutions. And the institutions themselves will have a causal effect on either encouraging or discouraging certain psychologies and approaches. So we had to have had John Locke and the Enlightenment ideas to even imagine that George Washington would be the guy who would be chosen. But then once you have a George Washington, and he does act consistent with the ideas that are dominant, I'm not going to be a king, I'm going to retire, consistent with the ideas that I have, that's going to have a loop effect that will only encourage America. Yep, we were right. We were right. George III is comparatively a tyrant. George Washington is our hero. And just look at him. That only further encourages liberty and independence by seeing a George Washington in action.
Yeah, and the next question I looked forward to asking you because it has to do with area of your expertise. So if we take Christian philosophy, can you explain some of the ways in which it affected the psychology? And I don't want to say psychology of a population, there is no such thing, but let's say a psychology of a man. How does Christian philosophy and things written in the Bible, how do they affect man?
Well, I'm going to be very, very broad about this here. If you believe, for example, that this life is a vale of tears, it's only a test, in effect, for some other dimension, and that the whole point of this life is to get into some other dimension, you've obviously discounted life on earth as a value. Obviously, your values are coming from somewhere else. Your standard of values have nothing to do with life and well-being on earth. You've separated the two. In fact, I'll go further. Anytime you posit the supernatural, you've driven a wedge between the ideal, the possible, what is possible in terms of the ideal, and the real, what is possible on earth. And in effect, you've split mind and body. You've split theory and practice. How could there be a theory practice dichotomy if you were just here in the natural world? No, for something to be good in theory, it has to pertain to some other dimension. Otherwise, you wouldn't say it's good in theory. So, morality consists of suffering. Morality consists in sacrifice. Altruism makes perfect sense. Live for others. In effect, seek martyrdom. Seek martyrdom. I was mentioning just before about how, in particular ways, Christianity was affecting the psychology of people in the late classical period. No longer was earthly success important to them. Why? Well, this earth isn't so important. Really important. No longer was the rational philosophy, rational science important to them at all. During the Middle Ages, for example, key works of Aristotle, his dialogues, all were lost. They did not preserve through the Middle Ages the dialogues of Aristotle, so we don't have them. Period. They're gone. What genius might have been in there? Or the scientist Archimedes, his method. It was lost altogether because medieval thinkers had no value to reason and science. To them, the philosophy of Aristotle or the science of Archimedes just didn't matter. That's the lust of the eyes. It's about this world. Who cares? So they discount reason. They're really their only way of knowing beyond the perceptual. They discount this life in general. So all of their values are shaped around some other dimension. And that will inevitably have psychological consequences. You're not supposed to be proud. You're not supposed to be ambitious. You're not supposed to be happy if you've achieved something here in the real world. Sexual, romantic love, no, that's not a value. The love of God is all that really matters. And so you have a culture of people who regard monks and saints as heroes. As heroes. These people who give up their lives, seek martyrdom, take vows of poverty and celibacy. And the psychology becomes, these are great men and women. These are our heroes. These are the people we should emulate. If someone is trying to be, ambitious, trying to figure out something in science, or try to make a fortune by selling a good new product, what are you doing? Jesus told us not to worry about what we wear and what we eat, but to focus on the kingdom of heaven. Ideas shape psychology, and the dominant ideas of a given culture will shape the majority of the psychologies. Most people don't think for themselves. Most people rely, in effect, on the ideas that abstract philosophers give them.
As you were just explaining this, something occurred to me. If somebody would try to buck the trend, say in a Christianity, and as the example you brought up is inventing a new product and trying to bring it to the markets and have other rational people evaluate that product, and if they're happy with it, participate in a voluntary transaction. It just occurred to me that there will be in a period of time where philosophy would be dominated by something like Christian ethics. How many productive men would be intimidated simply by the mass populace opposing them in this? And it just occurred to me how many men might have just folded in the face of that intimidation without, say, wanting to upset some of their close people. And it just extends the effects of the dominant philosophy to a lot of fields.
First, you've got the religious philosophers telling you that reason isn't important, faith is important, life on earth isn't important, getting into heaven is important. So anyone who comes along and says something different is going to face social pressure, psychological pressure to conform. Even if that person were able to resist, at least to some extent, that pressure for conformity and is an independent mind, his attempt to put it into action would face institutional resistance. Institutional resistance. If I want to invent some new machine to make myself profitable, make myself some profit, the church is going to say, wait, what? Are you going against God's plan? Look at the way the church, just in recent history, just in the 1800s and so, they opposed vaccines. They right. They opposed any number. They opposed anesthesia, even for women delivering babies. You're going against God's plan. They opposed birth. They still to this day, the Catholic Church opposes birth control. In an earlier era, they would have had those people executed, or they would have burnt, like they burnt Giordano Bruno at the stake, or they forced Galileo to recant. That's what happens as we go back and back. And further back we go, the worse it gets. The further back we go, the worse it gets. At a time when Francis of Assisi, this monk who's going out and saying, you love the animals and, pray, and this world is meaningless. If that's your hero, you're not going to produce Thomas Edison's and Isaac Newton's and John D. Rockefeller's. Those people are sinners. And those people face a legal sanction at the time. So this goes back to what we were saying before, there's an institutional feedback effect, but also the effect of the ideas that are actually being preached by teachers, religion, artists, and they get their ideas from philosophy.
Okay, so the relationship itself became much clearer in the course of our conversation. In the question periods, Peikoff gets a question along the line on the lines of what's your outlook on the future of philosophy and on the future of humanity. Now, I wanted to ask you a similar question, James, and ask you, what is your outlook on the future of philosophy and its potential effect as you see the world right now, given the information that we have access to today? What do you see as future developments in human thought?
Human history, looking forward, is different than human history. When we look back on it, and it's history, it's really history, it happened. We can understand it causally, but we still have to take into account free will. When we look back, the fact that people choose and think, in fact, that's what we're saying when we say philosophy is the fundamental thing that controls human history. We're saying the fact that humans think and choose impacts history, and that's a causal factor in history, particularly through ideas. When looking forward, we cannot predict for many reasons, human volition being primary among them. Human beings just simply can't be predicted, and a lot of the future will depend upon the choices that people make. Even assuming that the philosophy is the most powerful force in human history, and we have Ayn Rand, who has, in my view, undone, at least in a theoretical sense, the damage that Immanuel Kant has done, we now have the capacity to change history for the better. We have the cause, in effect, a fundamental cause for fundamental change in our culture. Now, will that have the change? Well, reality's on our side, ideas do dominate, and the most powerful set of ideas in the end will win, or has a tendency to win. But that still depends. I can't tell you when. I can't tell you the different. I can't tell you the specific steps that it would take to have it to win, despite its power, despite having truth on its side. I can't tell you that. There are certain. Peikoff goes into this discussion in terms of certain preconditions for history having an impact. Have we reached a level of knowledge where the discovery could be made and accepted? That's a contextual matter. That is simply a contextual matter. And but all those other preconditions are simply preconditions. They are necessary conditions, necessary causes, but they're not sufficient causes. Sufficient causes involve more free will. being applied, people accepting it. And when that happens, how that happens, because humans have free will, is very hard to predict. If the works of Ayn Rand survive, if civilization survives long enough for those ideas to take hold, we will win. When that happens, I cannot say. Probably not in our lifetimes. Philosophy is different than other fields. In fields like science, they can have an immediate impact in a way. If the culture is pro-science and appreciates science, obviously that has cultural and philosophical conditions too. But assuming you have at least a reasonably pro-science culture, a new scientific innovation can take hold and change the world rather rapidly. Even in areas like politics or economics, it can be comparatively fast. When it comes to fundamental philosophy, though, the change has to take time, and it takes literally generations. If we think about the centuries it took for Aristotle to really take hold and to create a renaissance and an enlightenment, that's the scale we're talking about. Or even on the shorter scale of Aquinas turning the Middle Ages around, as the Aristotelians, particularly Aquinas, did in the 13th century. That took centuries just to get to a renaissance and an enlightenment. So I'm afraid philosophy, it's true that the philosophic ideas of one generation, right, the new powerful philosophic ideas of one generation become sort of the bromides, common sense, and working attitudes of the next generation, but it takes time. That takes time. And there are factors that I cannot predict that will affect that time. So if we survive to the point where Ayn Rand's ideas take hold, yeah, she will reshape culture. She was operating at that level. That is to say, at the level of the highest philosophical abstractions, the very ideas that are the turning points in human history. But those ideas have to reach a certain level of acceptance, and when and how that happens in terms of timing can't really be predicted. So in a long-term way, I'm generally optimistic. I think we have the truth on our side, and we have a powerful philosophical system to get us there. But a lot will depend on you and me. A lot will depend on all of us who appreciate Ayn Rand's ideas, applying them to our own area of expertise, our own professions, our own personal lives. And that will start creating a wider view and an institutional feedback effect that will encourage objectivism.
Okay. Do you have any further comments or remarks about this lecture that you would like to insert?
I would point out that the theory that Dr. Peikoff here is really trying to reject is the idea that psychology is really the cause of history. But once you understand, as we covered in the beginning, where psychology comes from, it becomes an untenable theory. It is true that individuals will have ulterior motives and rationalization, and they will rationalize their given psychologies using philosophy. Sometimes people will use philosophy to rationalize their psychology. But on a mass scale, on a historical scale, that can't be what's operating. What's really operating is not some ulterior motive or some individual rationalization. What's being taught is overt. It's overt. Adolf Hitler did not hide the fact that he was an advocate of mysticism, altruism, and therefore sacrifice of the individual for the Volk, for the fatherland. It wasn't as though it was some rationalization. It was the overtly stated motive shared by many Germans, many Europeans, many Americans, unfortunately, at the time. And that's why, since it was so powerful in Germany, it could take hold. It could take hold. The ideas that control history are not rationalizations for widespread psychology. That might work on an individual level, but it cannot explain history. History, that the Middle Ages were dominated by religion, that's no secret. And how that had an effect, that was no secret. It's the overtly dominant ideas at the time. It's not some kind of psychological rationalization. It's the overt ideas of the time which are shaping the dominant psychology of the time, not the other way about. So that's how I'd end it.
Very good. Okay, on this note, I'd like to wrap up our session today. I'd like to thank our viewers. I'd like to thank James James, your input is always amazing. So thank you very much. I would like to encourage viewers to become members of ARC UK. There are plenty of privileges that you get by being a member. Also, please like, subscribe, and have a good weekend, everybody.
Yes, I echo that. Have a great weekend, everyone.